so much. Thank you so much for having me. I am so excited to speak to you all, to share some of my research, and to just share some general, very cool insights from psychological science. So my talk today is titled Putting Psychological Science to Work, Fighting Climate Change at Home and at Work. Awareness of the climate crisis and worry about the future are a deeply motivating a deep motivation for many people to act on climate change. You might hear about extreme weather events, you might hear about hurricanes, forest fires, and worry about your own safety, your own family's safety. You might worry about the state of the world that you're leaving for your children. There are myriad signals in the news that bring people, that heighten people's awareness and move people to action. So maybe you're reading something in the news. You are devastated, you are motivated. You might look around your life and say, okay, how can I make a change? What can I do? You might start by thinking about your daily activities. Maybe you drive to work. You're like, okay, I know cars use gas, gas is bad, climate change, great. How do I drive less? You might come up with a few possible solutions. Maybe you can take public transportation to work. Maybe you are on the market for a new car, so you can swap in an EV. This is great. Not all of these options are available to everybody, but if you're driving to work every day, this might be what you start to think about. Maybe you've seen bits of information like this that kind of break down the carbon footprint of different types of diets. You might have, I don't know, seen on Instagram, every now and then there are influencers that kind of make these pieces of information particularly salient. Maybe you've seen it in the news. Maybe a friend has told you they've gone vegan or they've gone vegetarian to reduce their carbon footprint. So maybe you've seen this type of information and been motivated when you are perhaps asked to choose a meal at your next wedding or at dinner. There's a lot of information that goes into deciding what you're eating for dinner, for example. Carbon footprint is only one piece of information. Your personal preferences might come into play. Sure, maybe vegetarian is a lower carbon footprint, but maybe you're not feeling like cheese that day. It happens. So lots of climate information is one of many, many inputs when we go to make day-to-day decisions. You might be considering the sustainability or climate change platform of different candidates when you are going to the polls to vote. But again, that is only one of many, many issues that a candidate speaks about. So you are now weighing your environmental attitudes, what you think politicians should do, what you think matters, with other very important things like economic and healthcare policy. These things tend to go together, but not all the time, and it's one of many things that some people think about when they're going to vote. I imagine many of you might think about it. What you might not think about is your role in creating the social world. There was recently a very cool study, which some of my lab mates worked on, that found that the social reality or the social perception of environmental awareness is pretty inaccurate. People tend to think that the average American doesn't support climate action, has relatively low levels of worry about climate change. So on the right-hand side, those bars in the middle, that black bar in the middle, you can see the perception is that maybe about 25–30% of people, of Americans support a carbon tax. The red lines are the true values. So in reality, almost 60–65% of Americans support a carbon tax, but the perceived norm is considerably lower than that. So that creates what's called pluralistic ignorance, where because I think most people in the US, maybe most people in this room, don't support a carbon tax, I might not support it, right? Our social world, our social reality really, really matters. And so by talking about climate change, by talking about issues, by talking about fossil fuel investment and why divestment is high impact, you're creating the social world. You are informing people around you, but also you are making it easier for other people to engage with the issues. You might also, maybe, think about how your environmental attitudes come into play at work. This is much less common, There are a number of reasons why. We will talk about that in about 20 minutes. But if you're thinking about what you can do at work, you might think of, for example, the picture on the left, greening the office, starting a recycling campaign, things that are visible, but things that are perhaps not integrated into the core business of your job. And maybe that's because you started working at the company a year ago. Maybe you don't know how a new product comes to light. Maybe you don't know how CO2 accounting works at your company. For all of those reasons and a few more, you might be thinking, what do I actually have control over? And those things ultimately end up being typically a little lower impact. You might not be thinking of cases like on the right, where you are thinking about how sustainability, carbon divestment might fit into the core business of your company. So what am I going to do in my talk today? I want to talk to you about how psychology can help us understand pro-environmental behavior, so behaviors that are good for the environment and help to mitigate the impacts of climate change, how psychology plays into these dynamics at home and at work. I'll start by talking about the psychological dimensions of household energy interventions. There's a large literature on this. I conducted a very large literature review of these papers a couple years ago for the IPCC. So what I'll share with you are insights from that large literature review, which interventions work well, which ones don't. This maybe informs what policies you're looking out for. If you're designing an intervention, this might spark some ideas. Or maybe you, as a member of a household, are starting to understand why some behaviors are harder than they seem, which ones are easy. You might see some of these things come into play in your own life. Then I'll present a framework for pro-environmental behavior at work. This is a less studied concept in the field. So I'll talk about the psychological factors that influence pro-environmental behavior at work. And then I will give you just a short case study of how status quo bias and salience bias affect managers' perceptions of sustainability policies at work. So that's the roadmap of where we're going. I forgot to say, I'm happy to answer clarifying questions throughout. I don't want you to see a word and not understand it, so raise your hand if you have a quick clarification question. Otherwise, Q&A at the end. Okay? All right. So first, we're thinking about household energy interventions. These are insights gained from reading nearly 600 papers on behavioral interventions in the household energy domain. This was all summarized in the IPCC report and a subsequent paper. But my 5 big insights, which I will show you evidence for in the next few slides, are first, attention is limited. Use it wisely. It goes hand in hand with applying interventions to high impact behaviors. We cannot pay attention equally to everything. So when you're asking people to change their behavior, understanding a few basic pillars of psychology can do wonders, right? Put energy and attention into changing behavior at crucial decision points. So when people are changing their routines, when they're moving, that's a great time to say, oh, and also figure out your commute. If you're moving houses, you're used to driving from your old house, figuring out a commute in your new location when everything is changing, when those routines aren't as entrenched. It's a great way to use attention to match the impact of behavior. Second, it's important to facilitate accurate and accessible understandings of risk, cost, and benefit, so making information digestible and intuitive. Considering the full timeline of an intervention, are you implementing an intervention that needs to be constant? Right? If you're doing something and you expect to do a one-time intervention, it needs to be measured in a certain way, as opposed to an intervention that you apply and kind of stays in place forever. In that case, there might be decay effects. And finally, complex information has to be accessible and spatially and temporally close to your target behavior. From this literature review, setting proper defaults and making behavior observable and providing recognition are some of the most effective interventions as measured in the literature. I'm going to talk a little bit about defaults now. Defaults are an excellent way of using attention and the kind of features of human attention to your advantage when you're designing a default. But first, if you have been in any psychology class, you might have seen this video. This is an example of kind of the core selective attention phenomenon in psychology.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball.
All right. How many times did they pass the ball? Anyone want? 14? 10? 12? 15. All right. 15 is the right answer. But the big question, how many people saw the gorilla? 1, 2, 3. A psychologist. Yeah. How many people didn't see the gorilla? Brave, thank you. Most people, when they see it for the first time, do not see the gorilla. This is a classic psychology example, but go with me, I promise it applies here. So now think about the climate crisis. While maybe the players in the white t-shirts, they are maybe told to attend to their household energy device. They have a thermostat that tells them how much electricity they used every day. I give that technology to you, I say, pay attention, try to use as little as possible. As we just saw in this example, you're going to pay pretty close attention to the thing someone tells you to pay attention to. How do you know that's the right thing? You might run fewer loads of laundry or dishwasher, turn the lights off really diligently. That might make a difference. That might make a pretty small difference. But you might be paying really close attention to your home energy device. And you're like, yes, I care about the environment. I am doing the right thing. Jordana told me to pay attention, and I'm doing it. I'm doing great. So you feel good about it. You are in your mind saying, like, I am doing my part. And you are. Thank you. But you might not pay attention to maybe taking the bus to go meet up with your friends downtown instead of calling an Uber. That focus on the thing someone tells you to pay attention to might divert attention away from other decisions that might be more impactful. Okay? So it really, really matters where we direct attention. This brings me to probably my favorite example of a behavioral intervention, which is the green default. In this example, participants are told that they are having their entire house, an electrician is coming, they're going to change all their light bulbs. And they're given a choice to either go with the incandescent bulb, which is pretty cheap overall, but actually doesn't last all that long. And it's about $50 for every 10,000 hours of use, compared to switching to a CFL bulb, which costs a lot more today, but is ultimately a whole lot cheaper over the same unit of measure, or over the same number of hours per use. All right. So in this study, the experimenters either, and the reference is down here if you want to read the paper. It's a great paper. You can either give people a default, which is they pre-check one of those two options, the incandescent light bulb or the CFL light bulb. So in the normal default option, you might say, stick with what I have, give me the incandescent light bulb. And if you've pre-checked that, people are much more likely to just go with it. If you pre-check the CFL, again, people are much more likely to go with that default. There are a number of kind of psychological processes there. The one that is most at play that this paper really focuses on is when you give people a default, there's an assumption that this is the endorsed choice. And that's usually true, right? Someone's usually deciding what that default is. And if the decider is trying to promote CFL, lower electricity use, higher efficiency, that's great, right? You are getting more people to adopt and to change something in their house. When the default is selected, there's an assumption that it is endorsed, and it should be. And there's this cognitive process that when you see something's endorsed, you read that option first, and you start to generate reasons why it's good. You're coming up with things that you like. So you might attend to the positive features of the CFL when that's the default, as opposed to when the incandescent light bulb is the default, and then you might attend to the positive features of the incandescent light bulb. Okay? They find exactly this across two studies. When there's a green default, so when CFLs are the default, people switch about 80% of the time, as opposed to when the incandescent light bulb is the default, then they switch about 55% of the time, so much less. Defaults work because they use attention. They say, pay attention to the good thing, and they kind of do this work of disrupting the status quo bias in this example. When the status quo is the incandescent light bulb, you default to the green option. that disrupts that bias. They also, as I said, encourage that evaluation of the green option, and they direct attention appropriately. When you are making a decision point, setting the default to the green option uses people's attention when they're making that decision. It intervenes at the decision point, and then in this case, and in others in this paradigm, they lock in that benefit kind of in perpetuity. You just have CFL, more efficient light bulbs in your house here on out. All right, so the next set of interventions that we look at or we evaluate in this review are obtaining a commitment, so getting people to agree, usually agreeing with some social component, agreeing in front of others or making that agreement public kind of has some mixed effects. As I said, when the agreement or when the commitment is public, it's more effective than when it's not. And reaching out during transitions, as we've been talking about. But reaching out during transitions is often more effective when it's paired with these other higher impact interventions like defaults. The next set of kind of medium to small efficient or effectiveness interventions are communicating a norm, so telling people what the majority of folks are doing, and providing timely feedback and reminders. So the prototypical example of a norm intervention in the household energy space is the O-Power intervention. So O-Power, an electricity company, an electricity provider, started giving people, using random assignment, a social norm on their electricity bill. So they said, Abby, you used this amount of electricity last month, but the neighborhood used 5% less. So they're telling you what your neighbors are doing. This it's a very, very well-powered study. It's beautifully done. They find a 2% energy reduction in just communicating the norm. That's huge. It's not the biggest, but it's very, very big. But what's really important here is that you need to consider the full lifetime, the full span of that intervention. So what do you expect to happen in the next month? That first month, there's something new on your bill. When I'm paying bills, I'm reading most of the stuff, and if I see something new, if you see something new, you're going to pay attention to it, right? So you're directing attention. But do you necessarily expect that to have the same impact in the second month, and the third month, and the fourth month? It's not new anymore. So it's super important, if the plan is to keep that intervention in place in perpetuity, to measure it in perpetuity. So on the right, you'll see that analysis. In black is the what are they calling it? Continuation group. So that's the group, they get the intervention and they have the intervention the entire time that you're seeing. The blue group, at the red dashed line, they stop getting the intervention. So you can see that the negative effect is good. They're using less electricity when they have the intervention, and they both have that in that first section on the left. Then on the right of the red line, the blue group isn't getting the intervention anymore. The black group still is. And you can see the blue group is starting to use a little bit more electricity. So now you're locked into an intervention that kind of needs to be in place. This is good though, right? They measured it so they know what's going on. So you know if you're locked in or not. Oftentimes in policy interventions, this type of measurement does not happen. This, I think, is an illustration of why it's very, very important to measure appropriate timelines when you're doing this type of intervention. The final kind of sad but least effective maybe intervention group are reframing consequences. So if you're in a particularly environmentally motivated group, given the environmental motivation, or if you're in a maybe economically motivated group, giving an economic intervention, so giving people information or reasons to do things in the language that they care about or based on what they care about, and making information intuitive. These both have small effects and are more effective when you design them well, which is what I'll talk about now. The first is to provide specific information, so making that information clear and very tied to the behavior you're trying to change. If you're giving somebody information, saying use less electricity, you should probably tell them which appliances to focus on. If that's the paradigm that you're in, saying your refrigerator is your greatest electricity user, that's really helpful information that helps people go from just broad information to action, right? And we're trying to get people to act. And again, attention is finite. You don't want them to have to go through and kind of weed out which appliances use the most. The second is temporal closeness. If you want people to do something, give them information really, really close to the behavior point. So again, if my refrigerator is the thing that is using the most energy in my house, I should probably know when I'm using my refrigerator a lot. So timing and spatial closeness are helpful design elements to make these interventions more effective. And I want to just end on a point about focusing on the right behaviors. We've been in the household energy space because this is really where the literature is, but household electricity use is not the largest contributor to greenhouse gases in the household or individual space. Transportation is massive, food choices are massive. So again, really directing attention, being careful about the effort you're asking people to give paired to the size of the impact. Why does that matter? Single action bias. So single action bias is the phenomena where I do something environmental because I feel bad or I feel motivated, and you do the first thing, and that first thing might not be a complete solution, and then you stop because you've done your thing. It probably took some effort, but you've gotten rid of that initial motivation. For example, maybe I'm very worried about climate change, and I recently read about how air travel is really bad. I might, when I'm thinking about my summer vacation next year, I might plan to drive instead of fly. That makes me feel good. That's not a complete solution because I'm still maybe flying to conferences or, I don't know, lighting my house. But if you ask people to focus on the wrong or the low impact first behavior, you stand to engage single action bias and not follow through. So, in summary, the psychology of household energy devices through that kind of policy and behavioral intervention lens, we saw that attention is limited and it is so important to use it wisely, intervene during times of transition. Things like defaults are a great way of kind of using these psychological phenomena of attention to your benefit if you're trying to promote pro-environmental behavior. Communicate well, that is both a feature of spatial and temporal closeness, and consider the full timeline of interventions and measure. Particularly if you are thinking about policy intervention, there should be measurement, there should be evaluation. All right, so next I want to talk a little bit about pro-environmental behavior at work. This now, like I said, this is a less studied space, so I'm presenting some work that I did to kind of map out this framework of psychological phenomena that affect pro-environmental behavior at work. So consider the individual. This is you. There are many individual level features. So we all come into work as ourselves. We have attitudes informed by everything you engage with, the people you engage with, the news that you read. That informs your worry about climate change, which actors you think are responsible for climate change, demographics, things like age, gender, race, political party, and then your behavior, so your environmental behaviors in other domains. Right, so I know what I do at home. I know that I'm maybe vegan, or I don't eat a lot of meat. I try not to fly when I don't have to. Those are all things about me that I bring into the workplace, and that kind of inform my individual identity. Then we'll consider the social features, so the perceived social norms of your environment. Those norms exist both at work and at home, so you have the social norms of your friends and your family. I have some animation to show that you have friends and family. Maybe you are in a volunteer organization with some other people. And then you also have your coworkers. So you have different social spheres. You probably have more than two. But these groups of people, you might have different norm perceptions for them. You might think, okay, well, I work with 350 Chicago. We're all environmentalists. We care. We understand that the city needs to divest. Like, we have this strong identity and it's environmental. But maybe you don't talk about this at work so much, so that identity isn't as salient for that group. You don't have a social norm you don't have a strong social norm that your coworkers also think that maybe the university should divest. And then we summarize that kind of with social identity or social fusion, which is that kind of high-level understanding of how close you are with your social group. And then we have the contextual features of the organization. So beyond just your coworkers that you interact with every day, what does the institution think? What do your managers think? What are the kind of priorities of the institution? It matters if you think your company or the university you work for care about environmentalism, because maybe your work on environmentalism, as mine is, will be, beneficial to the university and will be valued by them, right? So that perception functions differently from social, right? Your coworkers are not the same as your bosses and what you think the organization wants. And so in this study, we have 3 important outcome measures that I just want to go over quickly. The first is pro-environmental behavior at work. These are the actual items that we measure. So these are pro-environmental items that kind of go beyond the scope of your actual work, of your kind of prescribed job. Are you giving time to help your colleagues take the environment into account? Are you voluntarily carrying out environmental actions? Right? So not just my job is XYZ, it's the other stuff you do around. Maybe you take part of your job and are integrating sustainability features, but we want to measure things that are not recycling at work and things that are not specifically in your job description. We also measure willingness to discuss climate change. This is important because it creates that social identity, that social world that is, as we've been talking about, really important to kind of collective action on climate. And job satisfaction. The workforce cares more and more about environmental action, about ESG. These are topics that recruiters are thinking a whole lot about because they know that the younger employees and the employees that are entering the workforce now care a lot and want to join organizations that have, if not a strong environmental policy, an improving one. And so what we want to investigate kind of at the end of this study is if there is a virtuous cycle. If environmental action at work leads to higher willingness to discuss and leads to higher job satisfaction, right? Because ultimately you want people to stay at organizations and do environmental things. You want employees at, insert whatever big company name you're thinking of, that company has probably made a net zero commitment. That company probably has money that it could invest more sustainably. You want employees that are at that organization, that are valued by that organization, to help them and to push them to make and to meet those commitments faithfully, right? Because we, as outsiders to these organizations, often read about net zero commitments, but you don't know what happens. And maybe you're a little skeptical. But employees, you cannot hide it from them. So, virtuous cycle, we hope. So in a sample of US-based full-time employees in both high and low emitting industries, we sampled full-time employees across 2 samples. It's a little over 3,000 people. It's a very large sample. And these are relatively tenured people. So these are not folks who are 1 or 2 years into the job. On average, they've had, maybe like 5 to 10 years of work experience. So that's a pretty informed sample. Here I'm going to show you kind of each of these types of predictors, the individual, social, and contextual predictors, how strongly they predict work pro-environmental behavior. So the features that we just talked about are on the left, and the strength of the prediction, the correlation, is on the bottom. Positive will be right, negative will be left. Okay? So first, we see that in general, demographics predict some amount of pro-environmental behavior at work. These are aligned with what other studies have found. Higher education, longer job tenure, and being younger are associated with more pro-environmental behavior. Also, employees in low-emitting jobs report more pro-environmental behavior. That's not intuitive to me, that I was a little surprised by that, but I think it's actually because in a in a high-emitting sector like natural gas, agriculture, your company's environmental impact is really, really salient and is top of mind. So what we find is that those folks in high-emitting sectors are reporting more pro-environmental behavior, probably because they actually can point to behaviors that need to be taken, whereas folks in the tech industry or finance, which are the low-emitting sectors, are less aware of what counts as a pro-environmental behavior at work. So we also see that individual features, so now I've added the environmental responsibility attitudes and worry about climate change, are, small but significant positive predictors, particularly who you think is responsible for climate change. So these items are, companies should equally prioritize workers, customers, consumers, community, and the environment. The private sector has caused environmental degradation. But as you can see, not the strongest predictors of pro-environmental behavior at work. They come into play, but they're not, kind of moving the needle a whole lot. What is the behaviors you take at home. So your actions in a different domain, in a different social and organizational context, are really strong predictors of what you do at work. Maybe that's because you have a practice of talking about climate change with friends and family or colleagues. You might have that practice that might be part of your, just part of your day-to-day life. So you doing it at work is natural. Identity overlap. So this is the kind of overall social closeness that you feel to your coworkers is also a strong predictor. So if I feel more aligned or more at one with my coworkers, I'm more likely to act pro-environmentally at work. That makes sense. If you feel comfortable, you're going to act in alignment with your values or your desired actions. And then finally, organizational support. So the amount that I think my organization, my company, my manager supports environmental action, the more I am acting environmentally at work. We also see that organizational support and work pro-environmental behavior is positively associated with job satisfaction. Life satisfaction is obviously the strongest predictor of job satisfaction, but organizational support, perceived organizational support for the environment, and pro-environmental behavior at work are also part of that, we think, virtuous cycle. And as would be expected, all of these features, work pro-environmental behavior, perceived organizational support, individual attitudes, and social identity are positively associated with willingness to discuss climate change. So if I am doing environmental things at work, if I think my company cares, if I have personal attitudes, if I'm worried about climate change, I'm talking about climate change more. So you're, again, creating that social environment, social reality. So some takeaways from this framework. First is that individual, social, and contextual factors predict pro-environmental behavior at work. It's not just individual attitudes. So even if you really feel very strongly about climate change, the social and contextual, what your organization does, how close you feel with your coworkers, those things matter a lot too. And those things can be barriers, right? So if any of you are in positions of power, maybe you manage a group, talking about climate change, making it known that either you as an individual that works with people or you as a manager that is maybe more senior at a company, like that affects people's perceptions, that affects how people feel and how willing they are to take action at work. We also see positive behavioral spillover, or at least some evidence for positive behavioral spillover between home and work. So there isn't this crowding out effect, right? You're not kind of doing your good thing at home and then doing whatever you want at work. People want that consistency. If you value the environment, you see the connection between what you do at home and what you do at work. We also see that, like I said, perceived organizational support can facilitate pro-environmental behavior at work and can kind of kickstart that virtuous cycle. There are also some systematic differences between which employees are doing pro-environmental behavior at work. So folks that are more senior, men who are white, like these are the people who also are just more likely to act at work, and that is maybe because of the systems of power in which we all exist and work in. The last piece, kind of on that point maybe, is about a case study of managers' perceptions of sustainability policies at work. So this is much newer data, but I think provides a really nice case study of some of these phenomena. So this is a case study of managers and their perception of sustainability policies at work. So we took a group of full-time managers, and they listed sustainability policies that they're aware of. They either talked about their current organization, what was happening currently or what could happen in some aspirational future, and they either talked about their own organization or a peer organization. Everybody was a full-time manager. It was almost 1,500 people completed this survey. And again, some decent amount of seniority in here just to quality check our sample. The high-level findings are that the perceived meta support, so managers think that policies that are happening at their organization are more supported than policies that are at other organizations. And they think policies that are currently happening are more supported than policies that could possibly happen. We see the same pattern for feasibility. So the likelihood that a policy might happen at one's current organization or one's own organization is stronger than the feasibility at other organizations, and the feasibility is higher for policies that are currently happening compared to policies that could possibly happen. That's a bit depressing. It means managers are not thinking particularly creatively. That could happen for a few reasons. Maybe these aren't particularly environmentally minded managers, but also we think this is evidence for some really strong status quo bias. We think that we're interpreting these results as managers see what is happening and they're like, good, it is happening. And maybe that's fine. So people are not thinking big. They are not thinking of policies that are super high impact, could be maybe a thing that they get promoted based off of. We're seeing this really strong anchoring on what's happening in their own organizations, what's happening in their face. And we ask people to kind of dream big. The other notable finding, I don't know that this is shocking, is that managers have very little sense of relative effectiveness. So when we ask people how effective they think policies are, there's not much accuracy. In general, recycling is like the dominant theme that we see. We are asking people to give us like free responses. We are not prompting them with anything. And recycling is present in like 30% of individual listings. Recycling's great, but it's not everything, and it's a bit of a bummer to see that. Solar power is mentioned, or kind of renewables is mentioned almost 20% of the time. That's good. Cars travel about 6% of the time. What's rough is that recycling is not listed as being more impactful than solar power or traveling less. And that is, like, if you're just doing the math on CO2 reduction, recycling is significantly lower impact than those other two. So managers are really not so aware of what those relative effectiveness look like. Yes. So in summary, managers think policies that are currently happening at their own organization are most supported and most feasible, which is evidence of that sustainability bias, status quo bias. We would love it to be a sustainability bias. And that's probably driven by salience. They see it happening around them, and salience bias says that what you see around you, you assume is more supportive than it is more prevalent than it is, because you're sampling from your experience. Managers are not aware of the relative effectiveness, and recycling is incredibly salient to managers. So I will wrap up. Some takeaways for you all from, a relatively wide range of literature. When making household energy changes, focus on technology shifts and routine changes that require finite attention. So intervene at the right time and match attention to impact. Behavior changes that reinforce environmental identity can lead to positive spillover, which changes behavior and reduces negative affect. Behavior changes that reduce negative affect could lead to negative spillover. Organizational and social signals at work can lead to this virtuous cycle. So creating that social reality, discussing climate change at work, making it known that the norm is stronger than people think it is, can lead to a virtuous cycle. It can make people more willing to talk about climate change. It can make them more willing to act, and it can increase, in this study, job satisfaction. We also find that managers are affected by status quo bias when considering sustainability policies and maybe don't understand relative effectiveness. Your attention is a finite resource, so thank you very much for spending the last hour with me. But also keep that in mind and be kind to yourself when you are thinking about your own environmental actions. You know, we all, like, if we're in this room, we care a lot. We're scared, we're worried, we're angry. Your attention is finite, so be kind to yourself. And finally, your environmental identity can fuel your actions. So maybe coming to talks like this can reinforce that environmental identity. Maybe this gives you something to talk about with your friends and your coworkers, maybe. So thank you all so much. I want to acknowledge my funders. They're up at the top, and my collaborators down at the bottom. You can find me here. That's it. Thank you.